100 years on, the Titanic's still a remarkable thing. There won't be anybody listening to this podcast who hasn't heard of the Titanic. There won't be anybody listening to this podcast who doesn't know how the Titanic story ended up. And it still resonates. And that's very interesting because historically, the Titanic, sorry to say this, just isn't that historically important. It didn't change the world. In terms of loss of life, although it's very sad for those people who died, there have been far greater losses of life. So what we've got here is something which, in my opinion, resonates because it's moved from history into myth. And as soon as we start to pull that apart, the Titanic story tells us a lot about late Edwardian culture. It also tells us a lot about ourselves today. And that's just when you start to peel the onion skin and really get into the Titanic story. I talk quite a lot about the myth of the Titanic, but the myth, as any good anthropologist knows, is often composed of minor myths and sub-myths, which are part of the whole set. And so the Titanic has a number of component myths, which we all think we know, like the band playing Nearer My God to Thee as the ship went down. Actually, probably not true, but it's a great story, so never let history get in the way of a great story if you're a mythographer. There are stories that the captain's dying words were, "Be British boys, be British boys." Very probably not true, but it's the right story to tell at the time. There are other myths about the passengers, third-class passengers, being locked down below and being forbidden to get the lifeboats. Probably not true. But the best of all the Titanic myths for me is the big myth, and it's the big myth that the Titanic was the unsinkable ship. Now, clearly it wasn't the unsinkable ship because, as everybody knows, it sank. But a lot of people believe that the Titanic was built and publicised and lauded and celebrated as the unsinkable ship even before it sailed, let alone before it sank. It's not true. It simply isn't the case. What happened was that the Titanic, unfortunately, did sink, and the story about it being supposed to be unsinkable was essentially invented after the sinking to make a mythical significance out of a random historical event. So, although it tells us something about the Titanic in particular, I use it to show that today's society is just as much a mythical society as so-called primitive or pre-illiterate societies, that we have to find stories which make sense of the arbitrary, which make sense of random events. So the myth of the Titanic in the 20th and 21st century is a reworking of classical myths of hubris and nemesis. However, let's do a little thought experiment. Was it the unsinkable ship, and was God angry? Fortunately, we can do a terrific thought experiment, because the Titanic was the second of three identical, almost identical sister ships. The first of the three into service was called the Olympic. And the Olympic had exactly the same design, exactly the same number of lifeboats, or lack thereof, exactly the same captain, exactly the same route. It didn't sink. So nobody called the Olympic unsinkable because it didn't sink. The Titanic was the second ship. It sank, as we know, on its maiden voyage. But surely, if God had been angry in either an Old Testament or a Greek or classical way, God would have sunk the Olympic. It was the Olympic that got all the publicity. The Titanic was the slightly dowdy second sister. But the Titanic sank, therefore became unsinkable. And if that's not a myth, I don't know of a better one. The Titanic's something we all learn about through popular culture. We don't study the history, we don't study the inquiry report, the plans, the maps, the Morse code messages. It's through popular culture. And particularly nowadays through film. And for many people, James Cameron's film of 1997, Titanic, is the story of the Titanic. That's it. They've seen the film, they think they know the story, but they don't. I can understand why people are confused, because seeing is believing, and you often think that filmed history is history, and they're not historiographers, they're not historians, they don't know the differences. And also, a lot of these films make huge claims to their accuracy. Cameron, in his film, made huge claims for its accuracy. He researched the tableware, the carpets, the furniture, and he's quoted as saying, if you'd have landed on a time machine on the deck, this is how it would have been. This was it. And yeah, I must admit, his tableware, his carpets, his wickerwork furniture were very, very realistic. He even uses some little shots in the film which are recreations of rare archive photographs that only a real Titanorac, a real expert on the minutiae of the Titanic would recognise. So you think the whole thing is absolutely accurate. I don't want to break it to you, but folks, there was no Jack Dawson. There was no Rose DeWitt Bucator. There was no Cal Hockley. there was no heart of the ocean. So, yeah, it's very, very accurate, apart from the fact that the central characters never existed. The Titanic continues to be topical in ways which we hadn't perhaps expected. When there's a disaster, people often think of it in terms of the Titanic. That can be, sort of generally speaking, it's entered the vernacular. We can say something that's a bit of a waste of time is like rearranging the lifeboat to the Titanic, or full speed ahead, or I know I asked for ice and this is ridiculous. But it came home much more recently when the Costa Concordia sank off the coast of Italy. And it was very interesting that people were talking about it as though it were the Titanic, either by direct allusion or by less direct allusions. They kept on talking about the stricken liner. Now, that word stricken only ever applies to liners, and it applies to the Titanic. Whenever you read about the Titanic over the last 100 years, it's always the stricken liner. Stricken, it's like a Homeric epithet. It's like rosy-fingered Dawn or Pallas Athene or the quick-witted Odysseus. It's the stricken liner. And so the Costa Concordia became stricken. And then people started saying, well, it's the same thing, isn't it? You know, it's a liner and it goes down, despite the fact that although the Costa Concordia was very sad, I think half a dozen people died compared with 1,500 on the Titanic. The Costa Concordia went down in the Mediterranean and only went sideways. It didn't actually sink a mile and a half below. The captain, rather than sticking to his post, fell into a lifeboat and got to land before anybody else. It's almost completely different, but because the Titanic has such an important place in our cultural consciousness, our cultural memory, we tend to see other things in terms of the Titanic, even though when the only similarity with, say, the Costa Concordia is that, well, yeah, it was a ship. That's about as far as it goes, but we make the connection. So the Titanic, long sunk, still lives. Imagine if the Titanic sank today, that kind of loss of life, that kind of incompetence. Can you imagine the litigation on a cosmic scale, which would have broken out? Everybody would have been suing each other, heads would have rolled, scapegoats, inquiries, shame, blame, the whole thing. And so when I started my research on the Titanic, I expected to find much the same in late Edwardian popular culture. But what an eye-opener. If you look at the way the Titanic was reported and described in the years between 1912, when it sank, and 1914, when World War I broke out, there was none of this. There was none of this blame, culpability. They celebrated it. The Titanic, within hours, within days of the sinking, became a celebration of all that was terrific about being British, or at least Anglo-Saxon, being upper class, or at least upper middle class, and knowing how to die. So what the late Edwardians did, very, very quickly, they turned a tragedy into a triumph. Do you think that would happen today? I don't think so. So the Titanic, in addition to being intrinsically interesting, is a great case study of showing us how attitudes change over a century, and so the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about disaster and people and class and gender and nationalities has changed incredibly over 100 years. Where we'll be in the next 100 years, I don't know, ask me in 100 years' time.